They expected her to be weak, easy to intimidate. They didn't expect her to be trained to fight, but when she stood her ground, the real battle was just beginning. Imani Caldwell never wanted to stand out. In Benton Springs, Missouri, a town where everyone knew everyone, she learned early that being different made you a target. Her mother used to say, "Blend in, baby. It's safer that way." But blending in was impossible when you were one of the few black kids in a place that still clung to its old ways. At 16, she had mastered the art of keeping her head down, never making too much eye contact, never lingering in the wrong places, never reacting when she heard whispers behind her back. She focused on school, on her part-time job at the diner, and most of all, on her grandfather, Walter Caldwell, the man who had raised her after her mother passed away. Walter was a retired Marine and a former boxing coach. His hands were worn from years in the ring, and his voice carried the weight of discipline. He never pushed Imani to fight, but he made sure she knew how to defend herself. "The world ain't fair, baby girl. You got to be ready for whatever comes." So every morning before school and every evening after work, she trained in their garage-turned-gym, punching bags, speed drills, footwork routines. She was good, damn good. But fighting was just an exercise to her. It wasn't something she ever planned to use outside those four walls. Until the night everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and the air was thick with late summer heat. Imani had just finished a long shift at Grady's diner, wiping down tables and balancing plates for customers who barely acknowledged her. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and started the walk home, the pavement still warm beneath her sneakers. She took the same route she always did, down Maplewood Drive, past the old gas station, across the narrow bridge where the streetlights flickered. It was the fastest way home. But it also meant passing by the lot behind Baker's Auto Shop, a spot notorious for trouble. She should have turned around when she saw them, Colton Reeves and his crew. They were a group of four, leaning against the rusted hood of an old Chevy, cigarettes glowing in the dim light. Colton, the leader, was the kind of guy who had never been told no in his life. His father owned half the businesses in town, and his mother chaired the school board. That kind of power let him get away with a lot. And for the past year, he had decided Imani was his favorite target. "Hey, Caldwell." His voice slurred slightly. They had been drinking. Imani kept walking. "Too good to say hi now? Come on, don't be rude." His friends snickered. She gripped the strap of her backpack tighter and picked up her pace. "What's the rush? We just want to talk." She wasn't stupid. She knew how this worked. If she ran, they'd chase her. If she yelled, no one would help. So she did what she always did. Ignored them. Kept moving. But tonight, they weren't letting her go. Colton stepped into her path, his grin wide and cruel. His friends closed in behind her. Imani's stomach tightened. Something about tonight felt different. They weren't just looking for a laugh. They wanted more. But Colton had no idea what he was walking into. Imani's pulse quickened, but her face stayed neutral. She had learned that showing fear only made them bolder. Colton rocked back on his heels, flashing that lazy smirk he always wore when he thought he was in control. His breath reeked of cheap beer, and the stench of cigarette smoke clung to his clothes. "What's the matter, Caldwell? You too good to hang out with us?" His friends, Travis, Luke, and Shane, formed a loose semicircle around her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to make sure she had no easy way out. Imani exhaled slowly through her nose. "Stay calm. Think. I've got somewhere to be." She kept her voice steady, even, like this was just another pointless encounter she had to endure. She tried to step around Colton, but he moved with her. "Nah, I think you got a minute." His smirk widened. "We've been real patient, haven't we, boys?" Travis chuckled. "Real patient." Luke leaned in, his voice mockingly soft. "Bet she thinks she's better than us." They had done this before. Cornered her in the hallway, muttered things under their breath, thrown paper at her in class. Little games meant to remind her that she didn't belong. But this was different. This was isolation. No teachers, no security cameras, no passing cars, just her, them, and the night. "Move." Her voice was sharper this time, her patience thinning. Colton tilted his head, pretending to think it over. I don't know. What do you guys think?" Should we let her go? Travis scratched his chin, playing along. Maybe if she asks nicely. Luke snickered. Maybe if she says, please. Imani felt it then, the shift. The moment things went from annoying to dangerous, Colton's fingers twitched at his side. He was testing her, waiting to see if she would flinch, cower, beg. She did none of those things. Instead, she dropped her backpack to the ground, rolling her shoulders, shifting her weight. Small movements, but ones that mattered. Colton noticed. His smirk faltered for half a second, but he recovered quickly. "Oh, look at that, fellas. She gonna fight me?" Travis let out a laugh. "Oh, man, this I gotta see." Luke nudged Shane. "Hope she doesn't cry." Colton stepped closer. Too close. A mistake. Imani had seen this 100 times before in the ring. Someone too cocky, too sure of themselves, stepping inside their opponent's reach without realizing what they were walking into. She could hear her grandfather's voice in her head. They expect fear. Don't give it to 'em. Let 'em get comfortable. Let 'em think they've already won. Colton reached out, his fingers grazing her sleeve. Imani struck. Her left arm shot up, knocking his hand aside, while her right fist drove straight into his ribs. The impact was sharp, controlled, just enough force to make him stagger but not enough to break anything. Colton gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide with shock. His friends froze. For the first time they weren't laughing. And Imani wasn't done. For a split second, no one moved. Colton hunched over, clutching his ribs, his face twisted in disbelief. He hadn't expected that. None of them had. Imani kept her stance tight, feet planted, weight balanced. Never hesitate. Never second guess. Her grandfather's words rang clear in her mind. "What the hell?" Colton coughed, straightening up, his shock morphing into anger. "You stupid!" He lunged. Sloppy, reckless, all aggression, no technique. Imani sidestepped easily, her movements sharp and controlled. As he charged past her, she brought her elbow up, quick, efficient, catching him just below his shoulder. It sent him off balance, his momentum working against him. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself before he hit the ground. His friends weren't laughing anymore. "She ain't playing, man." Travis took a step back, eyes darting between Colton and Imani. Luke shifted uneasily. "Yo, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Colton cut him off, his face red with humiliation. He turned back to Imani, his fists clenched, breathing heavy. He was done playing games, but so was she. Colton swung, a wide, desperate punch fueled by nothing but rage. Imani didn't just dodge, she stepped in, closing the distance before he even realized his mistake. One hit. A clean, sharp jab, straight to his nose. The sound was small, but Colton staggered like she'd hit him with a hammer. His hands flew to his face, a choked noise escaping his throat. Blood. Not a lot, but enough. His confidence shattered with it. Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Colton's breaths came fast, erratic. His fingers trembled against his face, shocked more by the fact that she had hit him at all than by the pain itself. Imani stayed still, calm, focused, ready. "You crazy?" Colton's voice wavered, but the threat didn't land. He wasn't in control anymore. Travis and Luke exchanged looks. They weren't so sure they wanted to be part of this anymore. "Yo, Colton, maybe we should bounce." Luke's voice was quieter now. Travis nodded. "She ain't worth it, man." Colton's jaw tensed. He wanted to say something, needed to for his pride, but nothing came out. His nose wasn't broken, but it would be sore for days. Imani didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. She just stood there, waiting, making it clear. If they wanted to keep going, she wouldn't back down. But Colton wasn't built for a fight he couldn't win. He wiped his sleeve across his nose, glaring at her with a mixture of hatred. And something else. Something he'd never admit. Fear. "This ain't over." He spat the words like they meant something, but they didn't. Because the moment he turned and stalked off, it was over. Luke and Travis hesitated before following. both throwing her one last look, not of anger, but of something closer to respect. And then, just like that, they were gone. But Imani knew this wasn't the end. Imani stood still, watching Colton and his crew disappear into the dark. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She should have felt victorious, maybe even relieved. But she didn't. Instead, a different kind of tension settled in her chest. She knew how this worked. Guys like Colton never lost quietly. The night air was thick with the scent of cigarettes and sweat, but now a new feeling clung to it, an anticipation she couldn't shake. She grabbed her backpack, slinging it over her shoulder, and forced herself to walk home like nothing had happened, like her entire world hadn't just shifted. But as she rounded the last corner toward her grandfather's house, she saw the porch light flick on. He was waiting. Walter Caldwell didn't ask questions when she stepped up onto the porch. He didn't need to. His sharp, watchful eyes scanned her face, reading everything she didn't say. He was like that. He saw things most people missed. Who? His voice was low, steady. Imani swallowed. No point in lying. Colton. And his boys. A slow nod. Walter exhaled through his nose, stepping aside to let her in. Inside, the house smelled like leather, old books, and coffee. Comforting. Familiar. Imani dropped her bag and sat at the kitchen table, but her grandfather stayed standing, arms crossed, silent for a moment. You hurt? No. Another pause. You hurt them. She hesitated. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew what he was really asking. I did what you taught me. Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his fingers tapping lightly against the tabletop. Tell me what happened. So she did. She told him about the walk home, the way they surrounded her, the moment Colton got too close. She told him about the punch, about the way his friends hesitated, about the way they finally backed down. When she finished, Walter leaned back in his chair. He didn't look angry or disappointed, just thoughtful. You did right, baby girl. You defended yourself, but he let the word hang. Imani tensed. She knew there was a but. Colton's daddy is a man who don't like being embarrassed. Imani knew that too. Colton wasn't just some kid who liked to throw his weight around. His father, Gerald Reeves, was one of the most powerful men in Benton Springs. He had the police chief on speed dial. The mayor owed him favors. And his son? His son had just gotten his pride handed to him by a black girl he thought was defenseless. That wouldn't sit well. Walter exhaled slowly. This ain't over. Imani swallowed the knot in her throat. She knew that already. Because tomorrow morning, the whole town was going to know what happened, and not everyone would be on her side. By the time Imani walked into Benton Springs High the next morning, she knew. The looks, the whispers, the way people shifted when she passed. The whole town knew. She had expected it. Word traveled fast in a place like this, but expecting it didn't make it any easier. Some faces were unreadable, others were smug, and a few carried something she hadn't seen before. Respect. But respect wouldn't protect her from what was coming. Colton was nowhere to be seen, but his absence only made things worse. His boys, Travis and Luke, sat slumped in their usual spots at the lunch table, avoiding eye contact. They weren't talking. Not to her, not to anyone. Instead, it was the other kids filling in the blanks. You hear about Imani? She laid him out. She broke his nose. The story was growing legs. By third period, it was out of her control. Some versions had her knocking out all four of them at once. Others had Colton crying like a baby. The truth didn't even matter anymore. Then the first text came in. Anonymous number. You think you're tough? Watch your back. She stared at the screen, fingers tightening around her phone. It wasn't surprising. Just proof of what she already knew. This wasn't just about Colton. This was about power, and some people couldn't handle losing it. That evening, when she got home, Walter was waiting. Sit. She didn't argue. She just sat. He slid a newspaper across the table. Front page of the Benton Springs Gazette. Local teen attacks son of business leader. Police investigating. The article twisted the story inside out, painting Colton as a victim and Imani as the aggressor. It quoted Gerald Reeves, who called it a senseless act of violence, and said his family was heartbroken that a young man's future could be jeopardized over a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. That was the word they used when people like her fought back. Imani's stomach tightened, but she refused to let her face betray anything. Walter leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "You see what they're doing, don't you?" She nodded. They were making her the villain. And in a town like Benton Springs, once a story was told a certain way, it was nearly impossible to change it. Walter let out a long breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We got two options, baby girl. We keep quiet. Let this blow over. Or," Imani met his gaze, "or we make them hear the truth." The choice sat between them, heavy and unspoken. She had spent her whole life avoiding trouble, avoiding conflict, avoiding being a target. But this time she wasn't sure she could stay silent. Imani stared at the newspaper, the words blurring together. Attacks, violence, misunderstanding. They had twisted everything. She could already picture it. Colton sitting at home, playing the victim while his father made phone calls to the right people, spinning the narrative in his favor. If she stayed silent, the story would stick. It would be the only version people remembered. Her grandfather was watching her, waiting. Let it pass or fight back. For years, she had lived by one rule. Don't give them a reason. She had followed that rule, and they still came for her. So why should she keep quiet now? "I want to speak." Her voice didn't waver. Walter nodded once, slow and firm. "Then we do it right." By morning, the fire had already started. Social media was buzzing. The real story was spreading. Students were talking. Teachers were uncomfortable. Some parents were angry, demanding answers. And then there was the news station. Local reporters had caught wind of the situation. The school couldn't ignore it anymore. So, they called a meeting. The gymnasium was packed. Students, parents, teachers, and of course, Colton and his father. Imani sat next to Walter, her fingers laced together in her lap, the weight of 100 stares pressed against her, but she refused to shrink. Gerald Reeves stood first. He looked exactly as expected, polished, practiced, a man who had been in control for too long. "Our family has always supported Benton Springs," he began smoothly, his voice carrying across the room. "We believe in second chances, but my son was unfairly attacked, and now his reputation is suffering because of lies." His eyes flickered toward Imani, just for a second. "We just want accountability, that's all." Soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people agreed, some didn't. Then it was her turn. Imani stood, ignoring the way Gerald's gaze hardened. She cleared her throat. "For a year, Colton and his friends have harassed me. No hesitation. No softening the truth. They have cornered me, insulted me, thrown things at me. That night, they surrounded me. I defended myself." Silence. She took a breath, forcing herself to meet their eyes. If I were the one who lost that fight, would we be sitting here today? That hit its mark. A shift in the room. People looking at each other, questioning. Gerald opened his mouth, but Walter spoke before he could. "The real question is, if she were a white girl and Colton was the attacker, would you still call it a misunderstanding?" The gym went so still, it felt like the world had stopped. Imani saw it, the way people started seeing the cracks in the story. She had spoken her truth. Now, it was up to them whether they listened. The silence in the gym stretched longer than anyone expected. Imani didn't move. She had said what needed to be said. Whether they accepted it or not, that was on them. Gerald Reeves shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to losing. He was waiting for someone, anyone, to step in and take control back, but no one did. A voice from the crowd broke the tension. "She's right." Imani turned her head. It was Mrs. Delgado, the math teacher. She wasn't someone who usually spoke out, but there she was, arms crossed, looking straight at Gerald. "If that had been my daughter getting attacked, we wouldn't be debating this." A ripple of murmurs followed. A few heads nodded. Then another voice. "Colton's been a bully for years. This time it was Tyler Jennings, a junior who had been in and out of fights with Colton since middle school. We all know it. The room was shifting. Gerald could see it too. His face darkened, but he forced a tight, controlled smile. We're not here to dig up the past. We're here to talk about what happened that night. And what happened that night is your son got exactly what he deserved. That voice stopped everything. It came from the entrance of the gym. Colton. He looked different. His usual cockiness was gone, replaced with something else. Resignation, embarrassment, maybe even regret. Gerald turned sharply. Colton, sit down. No. Colton's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. I started it. I lost. That's it. Another wave of murmurs. This was unexpected. Gerald's hands clenched into fists, but Colton wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes flickered toward Imani, just for a second, before he shook his head and left. The weight in the room changed. The moment had shifted permanently. There was no more fight left in this. The school board shuffled awkwardly, realizing they had no choice but to move on. Walter leaned over and patted Imani's hand. You did good, baby girl. And for the first time, she actually felt it. Imani hadn't just defended herself that night. She had forced a town to face its own reflection. People like Gerald Reeves would always exist. They would twist stories, rewrite history, and expect the world to bow to them. But people like Imani, they reminded the world that truth has a way of fighting back. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always safe. But when you stand your ground, the right people will listen. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it. There are too many Imanis out there, too many people told to stay quiet when they should be heard. So, let's make sure their stories don't get buried. Subscribe for more stories that need to be told.